Cow poop is an ecosystem unto itself. There are many, many insects and other critters present in cow poop, and they're doing important work.
I try to get away from the phrasing, this insect's good, this insect's bad. They're just out there. They're just doing their thing. It's the situation and the environment that we set up that they can either become problematic or beneficial to us.
My guest today is Dr. Ryan Schmid of Ecdysis, and we're going to talk to him about how we go about managing these communities so that they can help us to take care of the cow poop on our operations.
You know, each cow produces 48.5 pounds of poop a day on average. That would take up, in a year, they'd cover New Jersey in poop. And if you look at like pasture fouling, because a cow avoids an area roughly 5 times the size of that dung pat, you're losing out. Our national herd we'd actually lose essentially the state of Tennessee to forage production because it's too fouled up.
All that and more on this episode 442 of the Working Cows podcast, brought to you by the South Dakota Grassland Coalition and Ranch Right.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows podcast, recorded exclusively in the Understanding Ag studios. Very excited to be joined today by Dr. Ryan Schmid. He is part of the team there at Ecdysis with Jonathan Lundgren, and we're going to talk to him about the 1,000 Farms project that they've got going on there, and mainly we're going to focus on this episode about cow poop and the communities that are present in a cow patty and the problems that cow patties present from just a space perspective, and how those communities of insects actually help us deal with the problems created by them. So very, very much looking forward to this conversation with Dr. Ryan Schmid, and I will share that conversation with you right after a word from our sponsor today, the South Dakota Grassland Coalition. If you're in the business of managing livestock, you've probably experienced drought, shortage of time, not enough help, and hefty debt. But facing one or even all of these challenges doesn't have to leave you worrying about how you'll make it through another year. Learn how to increase stocking rates, extend your grazing season, increase plant diversity, retain moisture in your soil, spend less time and money on weed control, and much more at one of South Dakota Grassland Coalition's grazing schools. During this intensive 3-day program, area producers, along with presenters from state and local agencies, combined hands-on activities in the field with classroom-style presentations to walk you through the steps necessary to create a grazing plan that suits your unique operation. Reserve your spot at one of the 3 grazing schools today at sdgrass.org. Ryan, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows podcast.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
I was connected to you through Major Eric Chaya, recently released episode with him and the work that he's doing. And he said that your presence there at the camp was really impactful for him and for the people that they were working with, as far as the owners of the cattle there and how they were handling pests and some of those things. So he mentioned in the course of that email the 5 Ws that Ecdysis focuses on. What are those 5 Ws?
Yeah. Like Eric said, we're really mission driven here at Ecdysis. That's our sole purpose for existence, and it really comes down to why we're here. We're here to help farmers and ranchers, and that we see our role in that. As far as what we do is we try to provide some data to support what people are trying out on the landscape. We see that is our major role. We're here for support for you guys to take those anecdotal stories and case studies that you see a lot of times on the internet and test those ideas and see if they're scalable across across the country, across different ranches. So no matter who you are and what you're trying to do and what sort of situation you're in, does what a lot of people are advertising as regenerative agriculture or regenerative grazing, does that work? So that's what we're testing out there. And yeah, that is our purpose for DICES. We've been around since 2016, and we've been all over the country at this point, learning from the ranchers that we work with.
Yeah, and that is a really helpful approach, and to take those practices that they're saying, hey, we're seeing results now. Can you show me why? Is that kind of what's going on? You're helping people figure out why it is that these things produce results. What is the actual, biological component behind it, or whatever that is? Is that kind of what is happening there?
Yes, yeah, you're exactly right. We try to nail down. Well, some of our experiments are just that. We're trying to look at what sort of mechanisms, because if you can understand the mechanisms, the underlying biological processes that are allowing those practices to work for those ranchers, then you can take that and adapt that to whatever situation somebody 30 miles away might have, the next state over, across the country. If we understand those ecological principles that are driving this system, we can do that. And then the other side of it is we have a large experiment going on right now. We're just trying to give people some support to say that our test is what they're saying true or not. And that's our big 1,000 Farms project that we have going on. That's what actually brought us out to work with Eric out there in California, as well as some of the other ranchers in his area, just to test the idea, does this work or doesn't it? Not even looking at mechanisms. It's just a purely, does it work or not? Does regenerative grazing deliver on these environmental, economic, and social benefits to farmers and ranchers? So we kind of cover a big area, but that's what we're here for, and we love it. We love it.
Yeah, tell me about the 1,000 Farms initiative. What is going on there?
Oh boy. How much time do you got? I'll be brief. This is our big kind of project that we've been working on in earnest since 2022. And basically it boils down to we're trying to use it to answer two questions. One, does regenerative agriculture work no matter who you are in the country, what you're growing, and what your situation is? Two, if regenerative agriculture does work, if that first question does actually end up being yes, how do people transition in a way that they can successfully get there without losing the farm? So we have basically two buckets to study that. We study people that have established their practices for at least 4 years. And we come out and we just take observational type data on the soils, anywhere from soil nutrients to the life in the soil, the insect community, the bird community, the plant community, as well as we do an economic and social survey with those farmers and ranchers at the end of the year. And then we have another group that we study. There are transitional folks. So folks that are just starting off trying to implement a regenerative style system, and we track them through over the course of 7 years. We come back and resample those places and we learn with them. That's what I always say is our role as scientists. We should be learning from farmers and ranchers and don't necessarily always assume that we're the experts in every situation. So we're learning with those transitional ones. We're taking that data and then we're hoping to use that to publicize, what worked and what didn't for those transitional folks.
So, what is the working definition of regenerative agriculture for the purpose of this study?
Yeah. What is our definition of regenerative agriculture? That is $1 million question right now. Everybody's got a different definition. So how do we do that in a scientific study? How do we make sure everyone fits into these treatments, essentially, of what we need to run our statistical analysis? So to do that, for ranching, we had to boil it down to, in grazing systems, 4 different questions, essentially. Depending on how they answer those, we can tell them if they're regenerative or not. So it comes down to what's your stocking density, what's your rest period, what is your rotation frequency, how long are animals allowed to graze in a paddock, And then what is your insecticide or I should say pesticide usage on that herd and in that pasture. Once we get through those 4 questions, we can score people. We have a few papers out on this. I don't know if anybody wants something to read before they go to bed to put them to sleep, but it has all this documented. You can look at all the ins and outs of that. But depending on how they answer those, we can give them a score of regenerative on a scale of 0 to 8. Same goes for row cropping and orchard systems. So we ask them similar questions of, basically built around the 5 soil health principles of, keeping ground covered, using cover crops, rotation of crop and integrating diversity, integrating livestock, all that stuff. We basically ask them the soil health questions, and depending on their responses, we can give them a score of 0 to 8 as well. Yeah.
Sure. I think that is helpful to put it on a spectrum or on a continuum, because I think that by and large, really, there have been quite a few practices maybe adopted, but I think that the practices devoid of principles, one, probably lack staying power, and two, maybe this is another side of the same coin. If you don't know why you're doing what you're doing, it's easy to quit.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's helpful to say, well, okay, yes, you are doing this. That is on the continuum. You're not a 0, you might not be an 8 if that's the way that scale works. But this is a positive. It's better than nothing. Here are some things that would be also continue to move that needle in the right direction. Is that kind of how it works?
Exactly. We kind of we meet people where they're at. We let them be how they are and what they think is working. And we just go out and measure it. And then we get a report back to them. That's kind of the most fun part. So all those ranchers we've been on, what are we at? We're over 1,400 farms and ranches across the U.S. from California to Maine and Florida and everywhere in between. They all get a report back, a 35-page report that says, this is what we found in your soils. This is how many birds we found. This is your insects. So that you see, what your management practices are. Here's your report card. And, we let the chips fall where they lie. Some people don't like that report card. Some people are ecstatic with what they find. It's just an observational data point for us. That's what we're here to do, is provide that information. You can decide what you want to do with that. But that's the cool part, the interaction, actually getting to see where people take it when they get that back.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so the 5 W's for ecdysis they represent or they encapsulate the mission. Is that right? Kind of the guiding principles?
Yep.
And what are those 5 W's?
Our 5 W's specifically?
Yes.
You're going to have to, where are we starting with? Who?
Okay.
All right. Who is who we are or who we're trying to help?
I don't know what the 5 W's are. I've never heard them outlined. So I was just wondering if you...
Okay. I think it's like, what is it? Who, why, where, what, and what am I missing?
Okay. When, how.
Yeah.
How isn't a double, but...
Yeah, so I guess...
Okay.
It's in our mission.
I see.
We're trying to help, our who would be, we're helping farmers and ranchers. We're doing that because we felt that, why we did it is there's a real niche and kind of almost this lack of scientific representation for our regenerative farmers and ranchers. I feel like we felt like they were neglected. If you're a conventional farmer and rancher, you know where to go to get the answers you need for whatever it is you're having troubles with. But a lot of our regenerative ones were not getting those answers. So we decided to fill that niche. That's our why of what we're doing. Our what is, we basically go out and test those ideas that these farmers and ranchers have come up with and see if they're scalable and transferable to other places where we've done it all across the country now. I think we're only missing a couple of places in the Southeast U.S., but we're going to hit them this summer. And then we've been doing this for 8+ years.
Sure. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I appreciate the measure of what is regenerative, the things that make that list. And especially when you're talking to ecdysis, right? We want to talk about insects. I don't know if you can say bugs, if that's appropriate or acceptable. I know some people get a little bent out of shape about that, and what's that?
I said, I'll allow it. I'll do okay.
Jonathan Lundgren's Twitter handle, I think, is Bug Lundgren. So I've always kind of figured you can get away with it. But.
Yeah.
But pesticides makes the list, right? Of the four things that your questions you're asking, pesticides makes the list. And so I'd like to kind of camp out on that and think about the way that those things are impacting operations and, some of the things that are happening in that world that maybe we don't see as keenly every day as we might see other things. It's maybe easier to see overgrazing than it is to see insect populations. And so I'd just like to camp out on there. Why does pesticides make the list? And you've got 3 of the 4 grazing principles here, depending on who you're asking, but pesticides makes the list and something else isn't there. So why does it make the list? And we'll start there.
Yeah. Why pesticides made the list is really started back in 2016 when we had a master's student that was going out and studying the dung arthropod community in some of these in North and South Dakota. And his name was Jacob Pachenka, and he basically went out and started talking with farmers and ranchers and figured out, what is important for them. What do they think is most important for making their systems work? And he was also interested in the dung arthropods. And so it came down to how would he essentially categorize to run treatments on these two groups. And so in a regenerative system, I think the important word in there is the second word. It's a system. It's a systems approach to managing livestock in grasslands. And so within that system, there are certain aspects that you can almost think of them as keystone species. They're keystone practices that kind of speak to a whole broader aspect to that system. But if people are focused on these particular things, it kind of helps to they encapsulate a lot of what it is that those ranchers are trying to implement in that system. So the reason pesticides we're interested in that is because it speaks to the larger aspect of trying to steward more life out there. And that's what these ranchers are doing. So if you're applying pesticides, and I'm not saying that there's never a situation where you find yourself in where you won't ever have to apply them. But if you're trying to avoid using them as much as you can, and can even just cut it out of your program as a whole, it tends to speak larger to how you are trying to steward life out there. And so that's why we ask that question. And that's why we ask the rest of those questions. They really all come down to the ecological principle of trying to build more diversity in a system. That's what they're trying to do, especially in any regenerative system.
Let's take a quick break and hear a word from our sponsor today, Ranch Right. We've all been there. You've watched the YouTube videos, you've read all the books you can find, and you've listened to some compelling episodes of various podcasts. You're in. Grazing is going to save the ranch. And while that might be true, there tends to always be a bigger problem. A bad gross margin, even with increased turnover, is still a bad gross margin. And with a bad gross margin, if you increase turnover, all you're going to do is go broke faster. Don't be a grazing zealot. Focus on profitability. After all, it's possible to outbusiness a bad grazing plan, but you will always struggle to outgraze a bad business plan. Bad business is just bad business, plain and simple. Don't get stuck there. Ranch Right has a team of financial experts who help you focus on profitability and ranching right. Use their actionable financials so you can create generational wealth and become a profitability zealot rather than a grazing zealot. If you are ready to see the power of good business and profitability, head over to ranchrightlLC.com to book your free consultation now. Ranch Right. So systems approach, I love it. My introduction to regenerative agriculture, I don't even know if the word was very popular back then. Don't think I heard it much when I was introduced to the concepts, but I was definitely introduced to systems approach. We want to teach you to be systems thinkers. And to me, systems approach, systems thinking comes down to 2 primary things. First of all, humility, that I'm not smart enough to know how one practice will affect the whole system. And secondly, and maybe this is again another side of the same coin, connectivity. Everything's connected out there. And if I impact one thing. If I go out and target one thing, I don't only impact that one thing, I impact everything else that's connected to it. Is there more to this systems thinking than that? Are there other things that you would add to that list?
No, I think that is a great way to think of it, Clay. I wish more people would think of it that way, including other scientists. I'll try not to rant on my own kind too much, but
they're not listening to the Working Cows podcast, so you can say whatever you want.
Okay, good deal. I'll go after them then. Yeah, I think what you said, and John Muir has a really good quote, but essentially, in a nutshell, it's what you said. Everything is connected out there. And the mechanisms that you guys are trying to do with building, let's call it a regenerative system or holistic, whatever you want to call it, is trying to bring together you're trying to leverage biological life and cycles and systems to improve your landscape and your herd, essentially, or your ranch. And so to think that, I always try to get away from these silver bullet solutions to problems. Usually those are never going to get you as far as you want to go or as sustained as you want it to be. So I think that is exactly right. I wish more scientists would think that way too. We often want to design our experiments where we control every single aspect out there. We want to control for every variable so we can tell that if we make this one particular management decision, I can recommend this to a rancher. They can do this one little tweak. It's going to have this outcome. And working with people these last 8 years that I've been here, or 7 years, I've learned that's not how the real world works. That's not how you guys work. That's not how a ranch works. You've got a million other commitments and other things going on. So I got to fit my studies into something that works for you. And so in order to do that, we have to do our studies on working ranches, and we have to accept that there is inherent variability in what's going on out there. And any recommendation we try to have has to be built upon, stewarding diversity. Everything's got to come along with it. It's not one particular thing we're trying to do. It's a whole host of things with our studies. That's where our advice needs to come from. And we need to remember that.
And I think that's kind of been the problem with science in the last number of years. I have no idea how long, but that it has become reductionistic and trying to isolate all the variables and just study this one thing. And especially in an ecological system, that is almost impossible, I would say, to get a really representative result from something where you've isolated all the variables. And so, first of all, do you agree with that?
Yes, 100%. Okay.
Secondly, how do you do it then? How do you study in these systems and respect the system, respect the rancher, and get meaningful data back?
I think that goes back to what we talked about earlier when you asked me, what is regenerative? And I tried to describe, how do we measure that so that we can put these places that we're studying into these treatment categories, essentially. And that's why when we go to a farmer ranch, we don't dictate, you got to be doing this, this, and this, and this, exactly like that. We ask them, what are they doing? And they get to dictate what they are doing. And we're just out there essentially observing them, and we can put them on that spectrum, that sliding scale of regenerative, conventional, and everywhere in between. And so that's essentially how we do that. And that's why we do it, because then our results that we get to publish on and let people know and advertise to actually help farmers and ranchers, that has more meaning because it came from an actual working farm and ranch. Those results it wasn't from some small university study plot that, was a 10 by 10 little plot. It was on a working farm or ranch, and it was part of an entire system that those farmers and ranchers had developed themselves. So I think that's the power of what we're trying to do. Yes, it's messy. Yes, there's a lot of variability in our data sets, but what we're finding is they tend to show, only the strongest trends come out of a data set like that. So we feel confident that it's real. at that point. If it can come through all that variability, it's probably working pretty good, whatever we find. It has biological meaning. It has real life meaning. And that's why we like it so much.
Yeah. Let's talk about some of the reasons for that humility that I mentioned earlier. Talk to me about kind of the way that you think about the populations of insects, arthropods and all these other critters out there, and go as large or small as you want. And just talk to me about kind of the way you think about the maybe different categories of populations and what they're accomplishing positively and negatively, and how some of those that are in the positive bucket are balancing and actually predators for some of the ones in the negative bucket. Can you talk to me about some of those things?
Yeah, different kind of groups or categories of insects. Oh boy. Well, let's maybe start off broad. So I like to think of, when I'm thinking of insect communities, just like I'm thinking of any other sort of biological community, I think of the community as a whole. And so I try to get away from the phrasing a little bit of, this insect's good, this insect's bad. They're just out there. They're just doing their thing. It's the situation and the environment that we set up that they can either become problematic or beneficial to us. So I look for, situations of where we can encourage a lot of our beneficial insects, so that the pest insects might be there, but they're never really acting like a pest, meaning they never become a problem for us. And so there's a number of different communities that we look at, and then when we're out there testing our stuff. So we look at, in grassland specifically, we look at the insect community that lives up in the foliage of the plants. We look at the insect community that lives down in the ground surface level and down to about an inch in the soil. So there's a whole different community that lives in the soil. And then I've done a number of studies the last few years on the arthropod community that lives in dung pats, cattle manure specifically. And they have a world unto themselves that they kind of live in, which is a fascinating one. And the reason we look at those is because they can change so much depending on management, and they're just so different because of the habitat that they're living in, even though they're all living in what we would call a pasture or grassland habitat. They're all trying to fulfill niches within that. And there's a number of different organisms that are considered beneficial, from the predators to the parasitoids to the tridivores, the fungivores, to what we would call pest species, to herbivores on the plants and all that kind of stuff. And they're just out there doing their thing. And it's funny, I talked about, a little bit, some insects are good, some are bad. Sometimes it depends on the situation that they're in. For example, I'm going to use dung pats because I love talking about cow poop so much. In a dung pat, there's 7 guilds or 7 groups of insects. You have your flies, and within the flies, there's 3 different guilds. You have mixed diet flies, you have dung feeding flies, and predatory flies. And the mixed diet are ones that they're both predatory in one phase as well as consume dung in another phase of their life cycle. And what we would consider a pest, some of our pest flies that are bothering livestock are actually consuming dung and recycling dung when the larval forms are in a dung pat. So at that life stage, you could, depending on your point of view, you could consider them beneficial because they're cycling dung nutrients. The problem is they're cycling those nutrients into becoming an adult pest on our livestock. But at certain phases, they can be beneficial. So it's kind of fascinating what these critters are doing out there. So yeah, that was a big, long-winded answer. Sorry about that.
No. It's great. I appreciate it. That's what I'm here for. The flies are only one of those. Did you say 7?
7.
Okay. And it's maybe the gist of the answer then is that it's not only, like you said, it's not good and bad necessarily. It's some of them are playing different roles even within a species throughout their life cycle, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so then when rather than thinking about it as good and bad, is it helpful to think about it as in balance or out of balance? Is that what happens when we see things that are, we see negative results as a result of some insect? Is it because it's out of balance and there's something that would balance that out that's missing from the system?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a great way to think of it. Like in terms of, as a manager of an ecosystem, as a manager of a grassland ecosystem, you actually need, or it is a good thing to have what we would consider those pest species around, even at low numbers all the time, because they're filling some sort of ecological niche out there, and they might even be serving as hosts or food sources for our beneficials. And so if those pests aren't around, let's drill down. I'm going to keep using dung pats as our example world here that we're going to work in. If we didn't have, our face flies around, laying, and some of our other fly pests laying their eggs into cow pats that turn into larvae. If we didn't have any of those things around, we might be missing out on our beneficial arthropods, like, let's say, parasitoid wasp. That's a specialist on those fly larvae. And for folks that don't know what parasitoid wasp is, they're kind of like this crazy wasp. They're not some big crazy looking like hornet kind of a thing. They're teeny tiny. They're some of the smallest critters on earth in terms of for insects. And what they'll do is they'll actually sting, or they'll oviposit and lay an egg inside or on top of other insects, and then that egg hatches and it'll consume that insect that it's inside of or on top of from the inside out while it's still alive. And so it's kind of a crazy thing, but they're great for pest control. And so if we don't have those hosts around for parasitoids or for predators to consume on, they're not going to be present in your pasture. And then when you do get a pest outbreak, like if you do get an imbalance, then it takes a long time for those beneficials to come in and catch up. So you always kind of want those hosts for those around so that they're there and prepared. It's kind of like having your army ready to go a little bit at low level, so that when something bad does happen, they're ready to go. You don't have to assemble everything and move everything around. You can think of it that way. So yeah, that's a good way. It's more of an imbalance problem when we do get outbreaks.
One of the things that I think I've recognized as a result of the Working Cows podcast and just the 7 years of doing this is that we don't really exactly know all of the ins and outs of why the 4 grazing principles or the 5 principles of soil health or whatever. We don't exactly know all the ins and outs of why these things make all the difference that they make in our operations. And that's what it sounds like the Thousand Farms Initiative is about in part is, hey, here's the data. This is why that works. And how that's connected to what we were just talking about is the fact that maybe we don't know all that's going on out there, but we know that when we have the 5 or 6 principles of soil health in place, and when we have the 4 grazing principles in place, it creates this environment where the beneficials and the not beneficials or whatever, where they stay in balance, where they remain in balance, and there's habitat for them to live, and they don't get out of balance. And so do you think that's accurate?
Yeah. And that's what we're learning with our studies is how those mechanisms, how those principles are actually, what is the underlying mechanisms that allows them to benefit farmers and ranchers. So one study that we just got accepted for publication, I was looking at the dung arthropods, again, kind of building off of Jacob's earlier work. I was looking at, what are the economic benefits to fostering dung arthropod beneficial communities? And we did that in South Dakota and North Dakota. We looked at those. And, as far as what we could figure out, or one of the main outcomes of that is I measured, what were the adult arthropods and dung pats on regenerative versus conventional kind of set stock grazing operations. And what we found was that those regenerative ones and the conventional ones, those 2 treatments each had similar dung arthropod communities, which is a shock to me. Like, I didn't expect that. That was contrary to what Jacob found. But along with that is I was trying to measure what are the economic impacts of this for farmers and ranchers. And so one of the things that I measured is I actually went out and counted the number of cow pats and measured how big they were out in pastures. So it was me, and I had a crew of people walking along and counting dung pats and measuring how big they were.
It's for the science.
Yeah, it was important. I know. I went to school for how many years? I'm measuring cow poop. But I was so happy we did that, because what we found was there was substantially less or fewer dung pats in our regenerative ones. And so what we think, we didn't actually measure how the arthropod communities were breaking it down, but what we think is going on out there, and it's probably, like we were talking about earlier, a whole system of things that's going. It's not just dung arthropods, but they're part of that system. They're part of one of the players in that. They're able to cycle dung so much faster. So basically, we found much less dung in our regenerative style systems. So they're just, that dung arthropod community, I theorize, is just doing their jobs better. They're doing their job better than in a conventional kind of system. And then that has economic value to ranchers. For instance, I had an economist help me out with these numbers. This is preliminary work he was doing, but he ran some numbers and he said, the economic value of that dung cycling, when you factor in, like pasture rental rates or the value of the land that they actually would be taking up by not cycling your dung pats and losing like forage in your pastures, it would equate to, roughly $8.80 an acre. And, depending on how many acres you got, that could add up, especially over the lifetime of your farm or ranch. I think of a 30-year career, how much value that would be. I like to always think of it in terms of, if I had 100 head of cows and 250 acres to feed them, over 30 years, that $8.79 an acre would add up to $65,900 that I'd have at the end of my career in value. And beyond that, we also measured, what was the forage production in these pastures in the regenerative versus conventional ones. And again, because you're cycling dung nutrients, so you would assume that you're going to grow, that'll help to grow more forage. So we measured that. And when we look at that, we get a significantly higher carrying capacity in our regenerative ones. So you can just, not only are you increasing the area that's unfallowed in your pasture, but you that leads to a higher carrying capacity. If you run the numbers over that same 250 acre ranch for 30 years, you get about 120 extra animal units over your career. And then at the end of it, to bring this whole story home, because we talked about, insecticide uses, that's kind of indicative of other things that are going on out there. So we asked them. So this was self-reported by the ranchers that we worked with, which ended up being 28 ranchers. What was their cost per head for applying parasiticides to these herds for controlling their pests or their perceived pests that were out there? Our regenerative ones were about 35 cents a head. Our conventionally grazed ones were $3.11 a head, which, depending on how many animals you got, that can add up. Over 30 years, that's a little over $8,000. But this is part of a whole system, and we can never tell quite what all is going to come along with that. And so we asked them what their vet bills are to keep their animals healthy. And it was a significant difference, about 3.5 times difference. The regenerative ones were $5.50 a head. The conventional ones were just shy of $20 a head. Actually, I threw one of the data points out because the conventional one there was one outlier that was so high. And if I would have left him in there, it would have been like $33, but I threw it out. So I made the conventional ones look a little bit better. But, again, it adds up over a 30-year career. That's like $43,000. So what have I kind of giving you some big numbers? I guess what I'm trying to say is there's some real economic power behind, stewarding life on your farms, and by trying to build the biology, by trying to keep those communities in balance and focusing on doing that, it has actual economic returns, often in ways that we can't predict. Because like you were saying earlier, there's so many other factors that I'm not going to be able to measure, nor will I ever probably know or understand that are contributing to those numbers. But this is just kind of what my simple mind can figure out with this study. But, sorry.
No, that's
That
good.
was a
That's
lot there.
bottom line. I appreciate it. When you start to just really put some numbers to it, that's helpful for sure. So just a couple of, so we've covered just a few of these things, right? As far as I've taken notes, we've covered 3 communities: the fly community, the parasitoid wasp, I think,
Yeah.
and then the dung arthropods, which you
Yes.
said there were 7.
Yeah.
So I'd like to hear, if you can, just kind of a brief rundown maybe of some of the other ones and what they're up to.
Sure. So there's 450 odd dung arthropod species in North America that are associated with dung.
And these are the ones that fall into 3 categories, is that right? Kind of dwellers, rollers, and tunnelers, is that right?
Well, okay. Let's take. So I said there's, of those 450 species that kind of fall into 7 guilds. We talked about the flies. Okay. The flies actually make up 3 of those guilds. So there's 3 of them right there. The parasitoids is guild number 4. And then the last group is our beetles. And there are 3 beetle guilds. So within the beetles, there is the fungivore beetles, meaning they feed on fungus and stuff like that. That's in and around the dung. There's our predatory beetles, and those are primarily what you're going to see from the predators is the Staphylidae beetles, or rove beetles would be the common name. If you're ever poking around with a dung pat, and once the weather warms up, you can do this probably next month, Clay. When you get a fresh dung pat, looking like a 2 to 5 day old dung pat, you'll see these long, kind of skinny beetles, and those are rove beetles. They are predators, so they eat other insects, and they can vary in size from really small to quite large. Like down south, they can be almost the size of your thumb. They can be big, but usually they're pretty small. And then the third beetle group is our dung beetles. And that's what everyone's familiar with. Within the subset of dung beetles, you have the rollers, the tunnelers, and the dwellers.
Okay.
And they perform different kind of roles. So yeah, we've come down. There's 450 species, and now hopefully, we've kind of gone over. They're all filling these wild niches inside of a dung pat, and they're all doing a job out there. And it's important to have them all. Yeah. Gotta catch them all, I guess, like Pokemon.
Yes. No, I thank you for that. So one of the things you mentioned here just recently was, talking about I don't know if you said the pesticide protocols among regenerative versus conventional operations, and they both had a budget line item for that. So are there alternative pesticide options that don't or are less impactful for those things? I mean, for me personally, it's culling, sell the animals that are susceptible, graze in sync with nature, and, don't create places, whether it's cows that are good homes for these critters that are impacting them negatively, or create homes for them in the landscape that is conducive to inviting these kind of critters in. That's my strategy. But are there other things? Am I missing something? Is there something I could be doing that isn't impactful or is less impactful to the stuff that I want out there and would also benefit the livestock?
Yeah, I think what you said is where I always recommend people start off with things. So the reason it is you're wanting to cull is, yes, there are certain animals that are going to be more susceptible to our parasites. So if we're hoping to, those numbers that I presented earlier in terms of, like how much it costs per head for parasite control for those livestock, primarily the regenerative ones just didn't treat. Now, it's not that they just, quit treating and then continued to graze in a set stock or like rotational way. They changed their management so that they didn't get parasite loads built up in their cattle. And so that's where the thing that has to come along with, okay, we need to phase out our parasiticides. We've got, in order to do that without getting cattle full of worms, we need to rotationally graze. And what I always recommend is, this is part of what works with you and your plan, but in terms of trying to avoid parasites, I was told by the parasitologist here at South Dakota State, our former parasitologist, Mike Hildreth, he's retired now. He said, parasites, at least the primary ones that we're worried about here on the northern plains that can reinfest our cows, when the weather is really warm in the summertime, they're going to hatch out of their eggs and get that little grub-like stage and get up on the foliage within 5 days when the weather's really warm. So to me, that says I want to move my cattle out of that paddock so that they're not regrazing them before they hit that 5-day mark. So I would be rotating less than 5 days, especially when the weather is warm. And I would not be returning to that paddock. The longer, the more extended rest, the better, because they will survive. They can survive, obviously, until the next year, some of these worms, but it's kind of a death by 1,000 cuts situation. The longer they're out there, the more vulnerable they are. And that's the most vulnerable part of those worms is life stage. So the longer I can leave them out there before bringing my cows back, the better. The happier my cows are going to be, the less worms I'm going to have. So that's why that works. Those are the mechanisms behind that. It's not just quitting that and culling cows. It's moving them and allowing the land to rest long enough, as well as encouraging our dung arthropod species. Those dung beetles cycle that dung into the ground and ruins the life cycle for a lot of our pests, both worms as well as our fly pests as well. So it all kind of works together in numerous ways. We keep getting back to that theme of why that works.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so our business model tends to be custom grazing. So culling isn't always an option for us. Personally, that's how we handle it with the livestock we own, and the rotational grazing is another big part of it, So say we bring in this population of critters, especially on our operation, and then as you go east, I think it probably becomes another issue where I've heard people talk about, as you're moving away from those dung pats. Well, yeah, but those flies have wings, so they can follow the herd.
Yeah.
And I'm not on a big enough place, and I would guess most people, the farther east you go, are on smaller places as well, where the distance isn't really going to become an issue where you're going to get away from them necessarily. And so, are there things that we can do that we can apply to the livestock, or are all of them going to have these negative externalities?
Yeah. So I think all of them, whatever you apply is going to have some sort of consequence. I'll put it that way. Now, the degree of that consequence is going to vary substantially. And this is where as an owner, or if you're bringing in cows for a custom grazing operation, if you can have a conversation with the owner of those cows, you can maybe help out your situation a lot in terms of what is applied to them, because that'll affect, there's an active ingredient of that parasiticide or insecticide that's applied that affects how long it's lethal for the arthropods, the beneficial as well as the pests that you're trying to get that community in balance. So the active ingredient is an important thing to consider of the product that's applied. The formulation, is it a pour-on? Is it a sustained release formula? Is it a injectable? Those all have a different length of toxicity to our beneficial critters, like our dung arthropods. And those are the two most important, as well as, the timing and frequency of when those are applied. Those are 4 important things to keep in mind. And if you can have a conversation with people or think through your own, what you want to apply, that can help you. So I can give you an example of maybe different situations where you can leverage this to your advantage. So let's go. Let's start with the active ingredients list. All right. There's 4 different chemical classes that we're primarily looking at, there's our macrocyclic lactones, synthetic pyrethroids, organophosphates, and our IGRs, insect growth regulators. So let's get specific down into, let's look at the anthelmectin, the ones for our internal parasites. And what you're going to find is those macrocyclic lactones. Those are the most common solutions that people turn to. And that's what you're going to be able to find the most available out there for people. So if I was looking at that, and that's what I had available to me, the active ingredients in order of toxicity towards our dung-dwelling arthropods would be the active ingredients. Abamectin is our most toxic, followed by doramectin, followed by ivermectin, followed by aprenomectin, and then the last one is moxidectin, which is, the street name Cydectin. And to kind of give you a reference, that those moxidectin or Cydectin is roughly 64 times less toxic to fly and beetle larvae than abamectin, which is our most toxic one. So that's a big difference. So consider those active ingredients if you can. And then next, your formulation, how it's applied. Is it an oral dose? Is it an injectable? Is it a sustained release? Generally, the sustained release is pretty long. Our oral doses are usually, roughly a week post-treatment in terms of toxicity, direct toxicity to adults, I should say. And then the topical to inject, the injectable formulations are roughly 2 to 4 weeks of toxicity. So to me, that tells me if I'm going to treat these animals before I put them out on pasture or bring them to somebody's place, I'd want to treat them at least a month, if not 2 months prior to coming out, and clean them up and get the worms out before they come to my place. And so those are and I'd rather it be on something that has an active ingredient that's less toxic. Now, that what I've talked about so far is just studies that have measured direct toxicity to adults and larval forms of our beneficial arthropods. We haven't even touched on the sublethal effects and what they've come out with. And that's why I said there's always consequences. The last 5 to 10 years, they've started to measure sublethal effects, and that would be things like fecundity, nervous system disorientation. Do they get the shakes or not for a while? And what they're finding is that these products have sublethal effects where the beneficial arthropods, especially, that's usually what they test, hampered, they're not going to produce a population as high for the next round because they're not as healthy. They maybe are slower or something. And a slow beetle is often a dead beetle in nature. So there's other consequences to this besides just direct toxicity. But if I was in your situation, I'd look at my active ingredients and what sort of formulation and see if I couldn't get that. And then there's something also you talked about. If you're really in a pinch, I always tell people, look at the white wormers. Their effects are usually worn off within a week, sometimes even a couple of days.
What would those be?
The group is called benzamide. A lot of times you see them in feed, but I think you can get them in different formulations as well.
Right. And I think, some other things that I think should be part of this conversation as well, like you don't have to treat the whole herd.
Yeah.
Treat the animal that's worse, right? Quarantine that animal so that they're not out there on the pasture affecting all these other populations, right? We've always asked our clients that we're custom grazing for not to treat them within 4 months of bringing them to us. So I guess maybe we're safe there.
Yeah, no, that's great. The longer the better. Because like I said, I was just running through direct toxicity.
Right.
There's sublethal effects that we really, again, there's so many things that we don't know. And so I think that's important to keep in mind as you're thinking. There's always consequences to our decision, both positive and negative. So, yeah.
So what about natural options? I'm thinking garlic, apple cider vinegar, diatomaceous earth. 1, do they work? 2, are they without consequence? Some of those things, how do you think about them?
Those are things I'm less familiar with just because I've tried to find literature on that. So my experiences with like garlic, diatomaceous earth. I have not met anybody that's trying the apple cider vinegar, at least that they've told me. Those are more anecdotal evidence. I don't have something that's scalable. And so I'm just speaking from anecdotal here. This is not proven in the literature at all that I've found. The garlic and that kind of stuff, I've heard of mixed results. I think the best ones, the reason they got good results is because they started mixing it into the mineral early. That's one of those things that you can't put it out there when you notice the flies are really getting bad. It takes a while to get into their system and have an effect on them. So you got to get on that early. Bet that's the same way with some of those other ones. They're not like a quick fix, but that's just my anecdotal experience with. But again, if you get to that point, it means there might be something in your system that you maybe need to take a harder look at. If you're getting to that point. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. There's always that one problem cow in every herd. Yeah, it gives you an opportunity to get better, I guess.
Yeah, I appreciate that. One of the elders at my church, he says the only difference that garlic salt makes on his operation, as far as he can tell, is it gives the flies bad breaths. But anyways, yeah, no, I appreciate your time today. I appreciate the conversation. And what are maybe some recommended resources, some things that you think are helpful for, the rancher out there, things that they could read or just resources that you think are helpful to kind of help people continue to educate themselves with regard to these things?
Yeah, I think maybe one of the best papers I've read, and it was written as a review, was anything by Kevin Float. He's a researcher up in Canada. He had a paper on like the dung arthropods of the Canadian grasslands back in 2005. Publicly available, I believe, PDF you can download, and it's not written with a bunch of scientific jargon. And I like that paper. I think it gives a good overview of what our dung arthropods are and why they're important. Because aside from those economic numbers I presented to you guys earlier, they're so important for cycling a dung pat, which is 80% water and a bunch of nutrients that you want in your soils as quickly as possible before they oxidize. But he also highlights in there how big a problem it can be if we don't cycle those in terms of, just physical space that they take up. And I ran the number. He runs the numbers for Canada, but I ran them for the U.S. here. I think as of January 1st, we had about 86 million, roughly, head of cattle and calves in the U.S. And when you look at like the physical space, if we would not deal with all that cow poop that it would take up, each cow produces 48.5 pounds of poop a day on average. That would take up, in a year, they'd cover New Jersey in poop. And if you look at like pasture fouling, because a cow avoids an area roughly 5 times the size of that dung pat, you're losing out. Our national herd we'd actually lose essentially the state of Tennessee to forage production because it's too fouled up. So think of that in your pastures. And I think Kevin Float does a nice job of walking people through that and then spelling out why we need these dung arthropods and what they do. That's kind of my favorite go-to study or review.
Yeah, I will link that in the show notes page. Appreciate that. Dr. Kevin Float is Steve Kenyon's favorite guy on those topics, and he's been a guest on the Wednesday night networking that Steve has done. So I'll try to dig that episode up and put it in the show notes page as well. So,
awesome.
Ryan, I really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.
Oh, good. Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
I very much appreciate Dr. Ryan Schmid for taking the time to join me and share his expertise and his perspective and the things that he's learned that have surprised him about the manure and the communities present in them. So really appreciated that conversation. I was supposed to get you an episode last week with Michael Thiele and Blaine Jurtis of Understanding Ag. Lord willing, that will come out this next week. Spring and summer, you know how it goes. So Lord willing, we'll see you again with another episode real soon of the Working Cows podcast.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.